Onassis Foundation. Dublab.
Welcome to the Quarantine Tapes, a daily podcast from Onassis, LA and Dublab. Hosted by Paul Holdengräber, this series chronicles shifting paradigms in the era of social distancing.
Hello.
Hello, could I please speak with James McBride?
Speaking.
James, what a pleasure to have you on the line. This is Paul Holdengräber calling you. How are you?
How are you, Paul?
I'm
very good. Very good.
I'm so happy that you're part of the Quarantine Tapes. Where do I find you at the present moment?
And at the present moment, I am parked on the side of the road, heading to. I'm trying to get a tent because for a memorial service on Sunday, so our church needs a couple of tents, and so they're in short supply. So I'm driving around to try to find one.
So am I, James? Am I actually finding you in your car?
That would be correct, sir. Yes, sir.
And so you're trying to find a tent for what did you say, for a service?
Well, two of the parishioners in my church died within the last month or so.
Oh,
so we're having a memorial service on Sunday, and we have to have it outside. So we need a couple of tents because it's a lot of old people and it's hot, and it's in the city. It's in Brooklyn. It's so I can't find one in Brooklyn. So I've been wandering around here in Jersey. I found one. I borrowed one, and there's another one at a store that's about an hour and change away from the church. So I'm headed there to get it, but I stopped so that we could have our quarantine conversation.
We are having you. I'm sorry, I'm keeping you from the tents while doing that. You said these were parishioners who died?
Two of the founding members of my church,
right,
who were older, died, as a result of. Well, you don't ask in my church, but they were old and they got sick and they died. I can't say they died from the COVID because people don't talk like that in my church, but they didn't die of cancer. I can tell you that. So it's just it's part of where we are now in this world.
It's very difficult. Will you be? What kind of a service will you be having for them? Will you be also performing?
It's a memorial service. We'll play. I got some musicians together and some people from the church, and we'll play some songs, and some people will give testimony and give witness to the life that these two women led, which is a life of extraordinary kindness and goodness. So I've known. I knew both of them just about all my life, and
right.
And they were wonderful. They were wonderful people, we're sorry to lose them, but they were old. One was 92, and the other, who was my mother's best friend, was 105. So
really,
they've lived. They've lived well. They lived long and they lived well, and so we're happy that I'm happy they're making their. I wish they hadn't died now. It's a little bit, not good, but I'm happy that they're rolling on. So we're going to have a celebration of life. It's not one of these, death extravaganzas that you see in the black church. It's going to be more, a little more upbeat, and we're having it for both of them together.
I remember walking by your church so many times when I lived in Brooklyn. I remember actually us coming in and trying to find you, but you were not there that day. And I also remember the incredible musical tribute you gave for Jonathan Demme. I mean, I will never forget that. I always remember it as such an extraordinary moment. So a celebration again, in a way, of an extraordinary life.
Yeah. Well, Jonathan's event was wonderful. I mean, that was that's what his wife wanted, and that was, was happy to be part of that. And we had a lot of really good people were there that day. It was quite, it was quite an event. Jonathan left us too soon, but he left what a wonderful legacy he left behind.
Incredible, and what the tributes, from so many famous people were all connected by to use the word you used, by the incredible kindness of Jonathan. Now, James, to shift slightly, maybe more than slightly, just a few weeks ago you said the cops adjust the tailpipe of the car. It's the car that should be the issue. Can you unpack that a little bit? What is the car, and how should we, in a sense, be fixing it?
I think I made that statement with reference to the police.
You did.
And, the reference was the police they have to put their mouth on the tailpipe of the car and eat the exhaust fumes, and the car needs repair. Well, essentially, we can't expect the police to unpack or to unwind, 400 years of American history, when most Americans don't even know who, they don't know who Abraham Lincoln is, so a lot of our problems, our social problems, are rooted in, our history and our ability to create mythology where there should be just straight up and down facts. I mean, Jesse James.
It's all right.
Jesse James and Jesse Jackson. Well,
okay.
One is different from the other, but
it's a long day. It's a long day, and we're going through. It's hard to keep things. It's hard to know what day of the week it is.
No. I mean, the only reason I mention that is because I was talking about Jesse Jackson to a friend of mine who was Aretha Franklin's conductor, and he and Aretha Franklin were very good friends, and he talked about Jesse Jackson a lot. But what I was going to say was that Jesse James was a slaveholder, and in addition to that, he and his men shot and killed an 11-year-old while they were in the middle of robbing a bank. Now, so that makes them child killers and slave owners. But they're also seen in this kind of a mythological sense as like these great American heroes, the kind of Robin Hoods and so forth. And so when you create a mythology that allows criminals and bank robbers to be mythic heroes, you can't expect your normal patrolman who's, patrolling Bloomington in Minnesota, Bloomfield, New Jersey, to be anything but a product of the environment that creates them. So we can't really blame. Look, I'm not saying cops should get away with murder. I'm not saying that, but there is a different system. There's a systemic problem that needs to be addressed. That I'm happy to see that these young people are starting to unravel it some. It's incredible to watch. It's very heartening. I never thought I'd see it.
So that in a way offers shards of hope.
More than shards, really. A lot of these people in this Black Lives Matter movement are not black, but they understand that it doesn't matter. And that is, in my lifetime, I never thought I'd see that. These problems that existed now, these Confederate statues and all that business, most black people walk past, and myself included, walk past them and don't think twice.
Right.
They're just not relevant to us. People hanging out Confederate flags just makes you, well, that's what they want to do. I'm just not going to have an accident with them. I'm not going to tailgate that guy. I'm not going to, just stay clear. Most of the time they're cool, but once in a while they're not. So that never bothered me that much. But, the fact that people are dealing with this problem is a good thing for all of us.
Sure, for sure. What do you think should be done with these statues? I know they're all different, but the statues that let's say of people. Oh, we don't.
You mean like slave owners?
Yeah.
I have a friend, my friend Patrick Strezak, who's a world famous sculptor. He wants to take the statues and melt them down and create new statues that exemplify the new America or a history that we all agree upon. I think that's a great idea. But I personally don't care what they do with them, because I'd rather the history of who these people are be correctly taught to kids in schools.
Right.
So that we can really understand them, so we can appreciate the difficulties that everybody during this period faced. It's not going to help us to go back and say you did wrong. It helps us to understand why someone did wrong, because most slave owners, or bonds, keeper of bonds people, saw themselves as good people. While I don't care, while someone else's self-identification doesn't hurt me now, today, it's important that I see why they felt the way they felt before.
Right.
And that's really important now as fascism starts to but walk into the American consciousness.
Right. And there are different kinds of reckoning one can have. I spoke with, you were mentioning your friend, the sculptor. I spoke with William Kentridge in South Africa, and he had an idea, James, which I thought was kind of interesting. He said, maybe we should take some of those statues off their pedestal.
Well, sure. I mean, however we can get to the mainland, I don't think, personally, I'm only interested in solutions. I'm not interested in the symbols that much. I'm interested in solutions that allow us who are on this planet to number one, live a better life, and number two, live a life that allows us to go to heaven or come back as a dove or as a shark or a whale, as opposed to creating and busying ourselves with symbols of an era that's gone past and with many things that many of us would just as soon forget. I don't really think it does this much good. I think it's good to unpack some of this stuff, and to examine it cleanly. Right. But then what we do with it now, I'd rather spend the money on education and seeing that our kids, all kids, get a good education, and that that all young people have to service the country some sort of way, and they have to work and that perform community service, as an obligation. I'd like to see that. I'd like to see some ink and some airtime burned on that. I think that's really important. And that some of these young people are doing it now, by going into the street and protesting and, making their voices heard.
I was really fascinated to learn that earlier this year you mentioned in an interview that you were reading the diary of Mary Chestnut, the wife of a Confederate commander during, I think, the Civil War. You said there's much to be learned about her thoughts, even today. What do you think?
Absolutely, yeah.
What is there to be learned?
Well, Mary Chestnut, despite her prejudice, was a good person. And if you're a writer that wants to be good, you have to look beyond people's disabilities to the good in those people. Otherwise, it's just, you're not really, there's no journey. And without the journey, there is no book, there is no film, there is no story. Mary Chestnut was an interesting person because she lived at a time when women could not vote and women had very little to say. But she was a very observant historian of the culture and a very fine writer. And she saw what was coming. She saw it in the black servants in her house, and she wrote it. She said, they are looking right over our heads. I mean, they're smiling and they're serving the coffee and all that stuff, but they are looking way over our heads. They see what's coming. And, so she's watching this revolution happen as a sole participant in a household that was full of people who were part of it, but who would not say anything about it, I used to talk about this with Jonathan Demme. I used to say, Jonathan, there's black people when there's white people in the room, and then there's just black people. And I wonder if it's like that with white folks too. I always thought that was the funniest thing.
What do you remember? Do you remember what he said to that?
No, he was just amused, and he agreed that that there is a dimension that we don't see.
Right.
And that our job is to get to it.
Right.
And so how do we get to it? With trust and love and compassion. And this is a man who really understood compassion.
Did he ever?
He was just, the story that...
Stunning. What were you going to say? I'm sorry.
That's all right. That's okay. No, he was stunning. He was as good as it come. I remember Edwige Dandicott at that service talking about Jonathan.
Yeah.
And what she said, Edwige is one of the best writers in the game. And she said, that a Haitian woman told her that she'd see this guy walking down the street with his daughter, and he was so nice, he'd stop and he'd chat with her, and then he'd walk his daughter to school, and she saw him every day, and she liked him so much, she started praying to God that this white man would get a job, would find a job. It was Jonathan Demme.
I know, it's fantastic, no? And I mean, Edwige, who was also on the Quarantine Tapes, is someone I deeply admire, and I remember, speaking with Jonathan about the years my parents spent during the Second World War. There was a tiny Jewish community in Haiti, in Kenskoff, and he immediately showed, so much interest. I mean, Edwige, of course. I hope someday that I can make a trip to Haiti with her and visit those 5 years my parents spent living there and see Haiti through her eyes and through theirs. They're no longer here. One of the things I've loved so much, James, in knowing you a little bit is the way in which you weave a story precisely together with music. You did some wonderful we did some wonderful programs together, both at the New York Public Library and then in Sun Valley. And you toured. I mean, it's hard to believe, but it's extraordinary. You toured with Jimmy Scott. What was that experience like, and what did you learn from him? And generally speaking, from playing jazz and writing novels and books.
Well, Jimmy's band was Jimmy Scott was real good about hiring young players in his band and mentoring them in the music. He was one of the cats who came up in the 40s, and he worked with, he was a phenomenon. He was a phenomenal vocalist, and he was a phenomenal person. And he was a great guy to work with. I mean, he was old school, though. He was very old school. You come on the set with Jimmy, you got to be able to hit, and that's it. I mean, one of the things I remember one time we were playing in Chicago, and I just had this conversation a couple of days ago because one of my classmates, a guy I went to Oberlin Conservatory with, and who I used to play with, and we played together at school quite a bit. He was one of my best friends at school. He was he was an organ major, but he came out of gospel. Then he ended up conducting Aretha Franklin's. He was Aretha Franklin's conductor until she died. And I was just talking to him a couple of days ago, and I told him how I went to Chicago with Jimmy Scott and how I was so scared because I had just gotten into the band and we were going to Chicago, and and he said, I know because I was there. I forgot that he'd come. But also in that audience when we were there was Minister Farrakhan.
Wow.
And I didn't know it was him. Somebody was sitting in the front, and every time we'd hit hard, he'd say, "Oh, yeah, baby, go." And he had a sweatsuit on, and, I didn't know who it was until after he got up, and there were two guys with him, two big guys, and then the bass player said, that was Minister Farrakhan. I said, "You're kidding me." And he said, No, that was him sitting right up front. But anyway, I don't know what Jimmy's response to that was, but I remember asking him at that time, because we had some downtime. We had to go somewhere together. For some reason, I had to go with him. We were in downtown Chicago, and I said, "Who were your influences? Who were your major influences?" And he said Paul Robeson, but that just shocked me. If you know what Jimmy Scott sounds like, he sounds like he's like a girl,
No, and the minute he opened his mouth, I mean, you couldn't believe the sound that came out. That's extraordinary. And how did he say more about that, or did you think more about that response?
Well, yeah, he did. He felt Paul Robeson was just technically a great vocalist, and he was. I mean, he was. He was more of a classically oriented. I believe he was a baritone, but he felt that he was technically so brilliant, and that he had so many different skills. That he was an all-star football player, and I think he was an attorney. I mean, he was quite the man. And so Jimmy Scott. It's funny because I talk to Sonny Rollins every couple of weeks. The great saxophone legend.
Yeah.
And Sonny is just a big fan of Paul Robeson as well. He talks about Paul Robeson with enormous respect. So I learned a lot in Jimmy's band, and I was always grateful for that. Being a musician has helped my writing a lot. It's helped me in so many different ways.
In what way would you say most of all?
Well, I mean, the business. It's just the business of understanding that the road before you there are paths to decide, and if you know what you're doing, you can walk into the woods as long as you have a general idea and the general skill. Like if you're a hiker and you have the general skills to survive, and now to mark the trees and, carry a backpack and wear the little vest that hikers wear, whatever the hell they wear, you know what to do, you can make it. And you don't have to be afraid because you know how to, because there's not a roadmap, but you know the technical and spiritual things to get home. And that's what music, specifically jazz, teaches you, And the really good jazz artists go down the road in a way that nobody else does. And that's what Jimmy did so well. I mean, he had a fantastic instrument, but his approach to singing ballads affected me for the rest of my life. Because as a young musician, I learned not to speed up and to enjoy and relish every single note, When Jimmy Scott sang in E flat, I mean, he really sang it. It was that note. It wasn't a million notes. You didn't go to a Jimmy Scott concert at 7:00 and 3 hours pass and you look at your watch and it's 7:15 because they're just going, don't try this at home. But, no, you went there and you heard a love song and your life was changed. And so it's not so much what you do with story, but how you approach it and what you give your characters.
And how and the quality you bring to listening.
Well, absolutely. You can't write or play without listening. Your job as a writer and as a musician is to listen to people. And if you can't listen to people, you can't recreate story. So you have to listen. Look, my job in Jimmy's band was to basically listen and then play 8 bars of a beautiful solo and then get out the way and listen some more. Maybe once in a while pipe in, a little response here and there, but mostly your job in that band, everyone's job was just to listen. When he sang All the Way, that meant get out the way all the way. And it's like that for all the great ones. Sinatra was the same. When Frank Sinatra sang All the Way, or Nancy with the Smiling Face, whatever it was, you got out the way. I mean, the great arrangers, the Frank Sinatra music, they knew when to speak and when to be quiet. Nelson Riddle and, Quincy Jones, they knew when to speak and when not to. And that's really the sign of an artist.
I feel that so much when you listen, for instance, to Art Pepper with the Miles Davis quartet, I think, or quintet. It's amazing to read the liner notes there. They basically had not rehearsed, but they knew how to listen. They knew how to listen to each other. I always remember my mother when I was very young, James, maybe 11 years old. She said, Paul, we have 2 ears and 1 mouth.
Well, there it is. You can get by with 1 ear, but you can't get by with no mouth.
That's right.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of that's kind of where one should live if you do this. You're serious about this.
You got to meet
about
once,
what we do.
You got to meet once. We were talking about Jimmy Scott, who had such an influence, as you just said, but you once got to meet a literary hero of yours, Kurt Vonnegut. I got to meet him once very briefly. But what was it like? And do you remember what you talked about?
Well, we talked about Wagner and Louis Armstrong in his living room, and we ate cheese sandwiches and drank whatever he was drinking. And I don't drink, but it was Kurt Vonnegut, and so you just do whatever. I mean, he was one of the few people I met that I was just completely wowed by. He was a wonderful person, very kind, gentle man, and profoundly intelligent. He said when he was at the Iowa Writers Workshop, they invited Ralph Ellison to speak, and Ralph Ellison spoke about the Russian writers or something. I mean, and they were expecting him to talk about black writers and black literature, and he didn't. And Kurt Vonnegut thought that was so funny. I mean, he was really a person who really, there are a few American treasures that will never come this way again. Donald Hall was another. I just finished reading his book. I never met him. He's a poet.
The poet who wrote about old age.
Yeah.
I want to read
What
that.
a wonderful man. Oh, what a wonderful book. What a wonderful man.
What is the book? Do you remember?
It's called Life After 80 or Living something, it's something like that.
Yeah, I want to read that. How fun. So do you read a lot of poetry?
No, not at all. I read Richard Justice for a while. But no, I don't read that much poetry. But it's just a function of not having enough time. I'm always working on the next book.
I know.
I read a lot of history books. And I just happened to read Donald Hall's book because I was in the mood to read some Jim Harrison, and I couldn't find any in my house. And someone gave me Donald Hall's book and said, well, he's got the same bloodline, and he does. I mean, Jim Harrison, who wrote Brown Dog and many other stories, was a guy who just had so much. He wrote like a poet. Poets are interesting because when they do write, if they write nonfiction like Donald Hall, they really have an enormous weaponry in terms of their use of description and character and moving things around on the page. They can almost like listening to Coltrane or Sonny Rollins. They can really improvise, and they never go back to play the same thing again. I mean, that's what makes Sonny Rollins special. He never played the same thing. All pure improviser. And the good writers like Jim Harrison and Donald Hall are like that in the long form. They just seem to have this ability to lift off. I mean, Toni Morrison, of course, and others, but they can go spatial on you.
James, a story. I don't know if I've ever told it to you. I had a friend who was writing a book about Miles Davis, and Miles was going to play in New York, maybe at Carnegie Hall. I'm not sure. It was sold out. So my friend called him up and said, I really want to go to this concert with a friend of mine. Can you get us tickets? And Miles said, of course. So he got him 2 tickets. And Miles said, is there anything else, Michael, that you would like? And he said, well, my friend loves My Funny Valentine. And Miles said to him, tell your friend to buy the record.
Look, you do what you can. That's it. You can't ask. Miles was deeply a man of extreme talent and deep conflicts, like many of us. And our musicians are tasked with the public belief that because they love music, they can just turn it on and turn it off anytime. I wouldn't dream of asking an orthopedic surgeon, a foot doctor, to look at my foot, while we're at the car dealership buying a car at the same time. So, we live in a society that has so little respect and regard for music, and at a time when file sharing has destroyed the careers of so many really wonderful musicians, and that's another story entirely.
It's another story that I hope to talk to you about at some point. James, it's been such a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much. I hope
it's good to catch up to Paul. We miss you in New York.
Oh, well,
come back home soon, son.
I will, and come out to Los Angeles. You have a place to stay. It's really wonderful it's really, really wonderful to talk to you, James. Take care of yourself. I hope you find a couple of tents this afternoon.
All right. Well, thank you, Paul. Take care now. It's good talking to you.
Bye-bye. Take care. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye.
To support this show and Dublab's progressive programming, go to dublab.com/support.